Let's take a look at a sample space where we're looking at a die. Actually, we're going to take a look at two dice that have only 4 sides. They have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, these type of dice actually exist. Right? And we're going to observe the different outcomes that are possible. So we have a 1 and a 1 that could be rolled. And if we roll a 1 and a 1, then we would get a 2. So that is created with a 1 and a 1. We could also roll 2 dice and get a sum of 3 where we have a 1 and a 2, or we have a 2 and a 1. Then we could have a sum of 4, and we get that by having a 1 and a 3 and a 1, or a 2 and a 2. We could have a sum of 5, and the sum of 5 could be generated with a 1 and a 4 and a 1, or a 2 and a 3 and a 2. We could have a sum of 6, and that is generated with a 2 and a 4. Remember, we only have a dice that has 4 sides, a 4 and a 2, or a 3 and a 3. We could have a sum of 7 generated with a, a 3 and a 4, or a 4 and a 3, and a sum of 8 generated with a 4 and a 4. Let's take a look at how many ways this sum could be arrived at. So a sum of 2, there's only one way to get that. A sum of 3, there's 2 different ways to get that. A sum of 4, there's 3 ways, the 1 and the 3 and the 1, and the 2 and the 2. You can have a sum of 5 in 4 ways, and then this decreases. For a sum of 6, there's 3 ways. A sum of 7, there are 2 ways, and a sum of 8 occurs 1 way. So first we needed to create our sample space. Our sample space is everything in the middle if we're looking at the ways that the die can be rolled. If we're looking at the sum of the die, then the sum of the die column would be our sample space. So it depends on how it's worded. Now down in part B it says describe the following subsets. Both numbers are even. So I'm going to identify when both numbers are even. That occurs with a 2 and a 2 and a 4 and a 4. So our sample space occurs when there is a 2 and a 2. Oh, I'm going to put a parenthesis around those. A 2 and a 2 or a 4 and a 4. Well, that's if we're listing how that occurs. If I want to list the sum on the dice, that sum on the dice occurs when we have a sum of 4 or a sum of 8. Okay, now let's take a look at least one number is odd. I'll shift to red here. At least one number is odd. There's a lot of times that occurs. I want at least one number is odd. Now I'm noticing at this point that at least one number is odd occurs quite often. It was almost the complement of part I, both numbers are even, but it's not exactly the complement. Okay, at least one number is odd. So all the circled descriptions would be the subset for at least one number is odd. And so that would be 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 2 and 1, 1 and 3, 3 and 1, 1 and 4, and then 4 and 1, 2 and 3, 3 and 2, 3 and 3. I see this list is long. 3 and 4, and 4 and 3. Okay. Let's finish this off with the last question. It says the sum of the numbers is greater than or equal to 6. So the sum of the numbers is greater than or equal to 6. Here we're focusing on the sum. So I'll focus on the sum We can either have a 6, a 7, or an 8. So there's many ways to look at this problem, and it depends on the phrasing of the question. I had already set up the table for this problem. If you encounter a similar problem where it says a pair of 4-sided die are rolled, then you could use this table. Or if you encounter a problem where it says a pair of 6-sided die are rolled, you'll need to make a longer table since there's more sides.